Good afternoon. My name is Jeremiah Ellison, and I am the chair of the Elections and Rules Committee, and this is the regular meeting of that committee. Joining me here at the dais today is our council members Gordon, Fletcher, Goodman, Jenkins, Cano, Schrader, and Palmisano. We are a quorum of the committee, and so we will get started. We have 3 items on today's agenda. First is a requested contract with the City of East Point, Michigan for consulting services for our Elections and Voter Services Division. Here to brief us on this item is Casey Carl, City Clerk. Mr. Carl.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. As indicated, my name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as City Clerk. This first item is a request to authorize a contract with the City of East Point, Michigan to enable our city's Elections and Voter Services Division to provide consulting services to East Point about the implementation and administration of ranked choice voting. This request is the result of a settlement agreement between East Point and the U.S. Department of Justice following a complaint that was originally filed in 2017. That complaint alleged that a pure all at-large voting system that was in place in East Point, wherein the mayor and all members of their city council were elected at large, had negative racial impacts on both candidates and voters. The Justice Department pointed out that no African-American candidate had ever been elected in at-large elections for city council, school board, or for a legislative district, despite the fact that African-Americans constitute about 1/3 of the electorate of the city's population. As a consequence, the Justice Department alleged that the all-at-large election method was racially discriminatory and a violation of the Voting Rights Act. The consent decree reached as part of the settlement between the Justice Department and East Point requires that ranked choice voting be implemented for the election of the City Council, starting with their municipal election this year in 2019. East Point will become the first city in Michigan to use ranked choice voting, and as the city is under extreme time constraints to make this change to a new system of voting, the city's attorneys have contacted my office to inquire if our team of election administrators would be willing and able to consult with the City of East Point on this process, offering lessons learned from the 3 RCV elections Minneapolis has already conducted, and especially focused on automated systems, tabulation processes, and voter outreach and engagement strategies. Obviously, we're excited by the opportunity to engage with another community so that we can continue to learn about lessons from Minneapolis. We see it as an opportunity to relook at our processes and learn from a hands-on implementation that also might help us to refine and improve our work in administering RCV in Minneapolis for the next election in 2021. My team has worked closely with the City Attorney's Office in drafting this contract, and it includes the provision that all expenses incurred by Minneapolis for the consulting work will be paid for or reimbursed by the City of East Point. I'm happy to respond to any questions the committee might have.
Do my colleagues have any questions? One question I have is, I know that we're sort of barreling towards our own election. How are you feeling about the capacity of your office to provide this consultation?
Mr. Chair, it's a good question, but having consulted with Ms. Wackler-Oates and her team, I think we'll be sufficiently resourced to continue our preparations for the 2020 presidential election cycle while we provide some consulting services, both mostly online, over the phone, web-based, things like that, but also a few on-site visits to help with their planning and implementation efforts. But this should not have a negative impact on our ability to plan for next year's presidential elections.
Great. So seeing no further questions, thank you, Mr. Carl, for the presentation. I'll move to authorize the contract for consulting services as presented. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and we will move on to item number 2. The next item is a simple housekeeping update to the council rules, and Mr. Carl will walk us through the changes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you mentioned, this is a true housekeeping item. The rules had previously required that public hearings be required on the appointment of individuals to the city's Bicycle Advisory Committee. The committee recommended that this requirement be eliminated. I should say that the Bicycle Advisory Committee asked that this requirement for a public hearing on their members be eliminated. That request came through the council and was supported by the Transportation and Public Works Committee in the last cycle and ultimately approved by the City Council. Therefore, this is merely an administrative process of cleaning up the rules, specifically Rule 7, Section 4, which says bicycle appointment committee members would be under a public hearing. This redacts or eliminates that provision. So it's a very straightforward housekeeping issue. No other changes to the rules. It simply removes the Bicycle Advisory Committee from the list of those subject to mandatory public hearings. I'm happy to respond to questions if there are any.
Great. Are there any questions from my colleagues? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Carl, and I'll move to adopt the resolution to incorporate this update into the council rules. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. All right, the ayes have it, and we will move on to item number 3. Our final item is to receive and file the 2018 report from the Ethical Practices Board, and here to present that report is Susan Trammell. Ms. Trammell, please take it away.
Thank you, Chair Ellison, members of the committee. I am Susan Trammell, the city's ethics officer. The Ethical Practices Board has approved their 2018 annual report, which was distributed to all of your offices on Friday and has been distributed to all department heads and will be posted online at the Ethical Practices Board website once this has been received and filed by council. There are a few highlights that I want to pull out from the annual report. The first relates to the education of employees related to the ethics code. Statistically, things have not changed much in recent years. We're hovering in the vicinity of low 80% compliance with the ethics code. We always have a fair number of employees out of compliance on the given day that I run the report. We run this through Comet, which means the numbers that I use could be changed the next day should someone take their training or someone else become out of compliance. So as of the snapshot that I take at the end of the year, each year, we're running about 80% of employees that have complied. So we have about 20% out of compliance and an additional 20% usually that will fall out of compliance the next year. So those are the two numbers. Things just haven't changed much. We did work with the HR department in implementing a new refresher training that's available online. This is the second iteration of the online training. We have already begun to start planning for the next iteration, which we'll need in 2 more years, or 2.5 years. The other thing that I'd like to bring up relates to ethics inquiries. There are generally 4 top categories of ethics inquiry, and in any given year, they change place from 1, 2, and 3 when I report on the top 3, but there's generally 4 big categories of inquiries, and then the other things fall in at much lower percentages. Those 4 categories are gifts, conflict of interest, use of city resources, and outside employment. The board has seen, and I have seen as well, an increase in the number and complexity of the conflict of interest questions that are coming forward, and the board has been actively discussing those and may be proposing in the next year some potential changes to address some of the things that they've seen. As to ethics complaints, the complaints volume-wise are running about the same as in prior years. The numbers you will note, we had 46 new complaints alleging 73 allegations in those complaints. Now, if you look at the report, it will show that we received 48 complaints on page 11, and that's because sometimes complaints are reported in multiple ways. Sometimes we have multiple reports of the same complaint from different parties. Sometimes they're received in more than one manner. So that's why it's the numbers don't add up. And they have never once, I don't think, ever matched up, because sometimes the same person will go and report the same complaint later, again, in a new complaint number. So we have lots of those kinds of situations. The topics of the complaints are also listed in the report. And the portion of the complaints that come in through the hotline, that I'm under staff direction from this council to report through the ethics line, and through the ethics board report. Now, the ethics report line receives more than just ethics complaints. So there are complaints that are counted that are not purely ethics. And as you can see from the chart that begins on page 11 and goes through page 12, of the 46 complaints that came through, actually of the allegations, so this is now we're covering the 73 allegations, we had 5 come through that related to employee relations or other management issues. 2 that were policy violations not related to the ethics code, 6 that related to compliance with other laws, and 1 involving ethical aspirations, which by the nature and the language of the code are not actionable. They are purely aspirational sections. And so that is a constant as well. You can see from that historical chart that we get a fair number of those each time. The other thing that is included in this chart are the complaints that come in through the hotline or directly to me, alleging a violation of the anti-discrimination, harassment, retaliation policy that the city has, which we have an identical provision in the ethics code. Okay, and the provision in the code is because the policy itself doesn't cover board and commission members, and it doesn't cover elected officials, but the ethics code does. So we have that duplication. And so when complaints come in to me via either the hotline or directly, they are then referred to the HR department for handling through their ADH&R investigative unit. And the thing that's not included in this number of 14 of those complaints are the ones that the HR unit receives directly. Okay, so they last year received 43 additional complaints. Those numbers aren't reflected in mine. So the top complaint, if you count those ADH&R complaints, is ADH&R. So discrimination or harassment is the number 1 complaint that we would receive if we counted those from HR. At the bottom of page 12 is a discussion, a chart related to the outcomes of the various cases. Of the matters that closed, there are 13 that remain open. 22 were unsubstantiated. 11 were given coaching as the outcome. And so on the matters that come before us, through the hotline mainly, but through me as well, most of them are unsubstantiated. The last chart that I want to point out relates to the degree of anonymous calls. That's on page 13. And we, as a city, have a very high percentage of anonymous callers, much higher than the contracted service that we use for the report line. As to their other clients, we are much higher. We are at 78%, and their clients, the most recent data that I have for them was from 2017 at 56%. So we have a much higher percentage of anonymous callers than their regular client base. And that's a concern because that is evidence that the reporters fear retaliation by reporting. So those are the things that I wanted to highlight for this council, and I can stand for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Trammell. Are there any questions from my colleagues? All right. Thank you for your presentation. Seeing no further questions. Oh, before we get to that, I just want to acknowledge that we've been joined by Councilmember Bender. And with that, I will move to receive and file the annual report. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. And the ayes have it. And that concludes our items of business for today's committee. So with no further business before us, committee is adjourned. Thank you.